Welcome to Llanfair pwllgwyngyll gogery chwyrn drobwll tysilio goch. And deep breath. Known all over the world as the home of the longest place name in Europe, this large village on the island of Anglesey, in northwest Wales, is an intriguing destination. And while many pass through simply to get a picture of the sign and have a go at pronouncing its name, there's actually a few more fascinating things to see here. So on this walk around the village on a beautifully sunny morning, we'll not only delve into the history of that immense name, but we'll also explore the heritage of the local community, as we stroll past a number of historic pubs, admire the local clock tower, and venture out to the edge of the village to the historic St Mary's Church, as well as the spectacular monument to Vice Admiral Nelson, which gazes out across the Menai Strait towards the Welsh mainland. All of that is to come as we make our way around this village, but we begin our walk on platform 2 of the local railway station, where there stands a sign of the village's name, complete with a helpful pronunciation guide. So read it with me. Llanfair pwllgwyngyll gogery chwyrn drobwll tysilio goch. Got it? Fantastic. Now that sign is one of the many attractions that draw people to this village's railway station. In fact, we can see a train pulling into the platform just now. But the truth is that the station, which originally opened all the way back in the early Victorian era, in 1848, actually began life with a different and much shorter name. Historically known simply as Llanfair pwllgwyngyll, there's actually a bit of ambiguity as to exactly when or exactly how this station came to be known by its now world-famous long name. But it's generally agreed that it was coined as a marketing stunt in an effort to draw Victorian tourists into the area. Possibly devised by a local tailor, or perhaps even a cobbler from the neighbouring town of Menai Bridge at some point in the 1850s or 60s, the name Llanfair pwllgwyngyll gogery chwyrn drobwll tysilio goch gave this station the longest station name in the whole country, and it was hoped that this peculiarity would attract people from all over to come and visit the village. Amazingly, not only did it work then, but it continues to work to this day. We're here taking a stroll around the village to explore its history and many sites, but as many as 200,000 tourists now visit this village every year as well, almost all of whom are drawn here by that lengthy name and its ever-growing popularity on the internet. But of course, a 58-character, 18-syllable long word is not the most convenient way to refer to your hometown if you live here. And you won't be surprised to hear that the locals don't use this full, extended name to tell you where they live. As we mentioned before the marketing stunt, this village was known historically by the shorter name Llanfair pwllgwyngyll, but even that's a little long, so most people shorten it to the much simpler Llanfair PG, or Llanfair pwll. So for the rest of our walk, we're going to do as the locals do and refer to this village simply as Llanfair PG, unless I'm feeling brave and fancy another go at the full extended name. Though I must give my apologies to any Welsh speakers listening along for my attempts at pronouncing the name. Anyway, we've now made our way off the platform and into the rather large station car park. And as we walk across it, let's take a brief look at a map of Wales to get a better idea of exactly where Llanfair PG is located. As we noted earlier, the village is located on the large island of Anglesey in the northwest of Wales, which is separated from the mainland by the narrow Menai Strait, which we'll get a glimpse of at the end of our walk. Now, Llanfair PG's location on the very edge of Anglesey has played a major role in its history, and the local geography can also help to unlock the meaning behind its long, extended name, which we can see helpfully explained on this sign above the village's main department store. So if you were wondering what the village's name actually means, it means, deep breath again, the Church of Mary in the hollow of the White Hazel near the fierce whirlpool and the Church of Tysilio by the Red Cave. I think that's clear enough. Now, even when translated into English, it's still basically impossible to make head or tail of the meaning of the village's name. But to put it simply, it's derived from a number of local landmarks to be found in and around the area, many of which you'll find depicted on postcards and other knickknacks to be found at this lovely gift shop in the department store. But let's explain the name in more detail. Llanfair is the Welsh word for the historic parish church of St Mary, which we'll be visiting at the end of our walk. Pwllgwyngyll after it is the hollow of the white hazel, to be found in a nearby forest. Gogery means near to, chwyrn drobwll are the rapid whirlpools in the waters of the Menai Strait, llan tysilio is another church, the Church of St Tysilio on an island in the Menai Strait, and finally goch is the Red Cave, although bizarrely there aren't actually any red caves to be found around here. It's thought that the man who coined the name simply added the goch at the end, either because he liked the sound, or perhaps because he was inspired by another Welsh town further to the south in Carmarthenshire, which is known as Llantysilio gogo, where there are in fact red caves to be found. Either way, as we can see here, the plan to draw tourists into the area with the long name worked like a charm, even if some bits of it are completely irrelevant to the local area. But this bilingual sign, welcoming visitors in both English and Welsh, brings us to another interesting point about the local area, and the fact that you're just as likely, if not even more likely, to hear the Welsh language being spoken on the streets of Llanfair PG. While everybody here certainly speaks English, the northwest of Wales here is widely regarded as the heartland of the national language. And more than 70% of the roughly 3,000 people who live here in Llanfair PG can speak Welsh, many of whom do so as a first language too. On a late night, the Penrhos Arms across the road here will undoubtedly be lively with Celtic tones, this historic local pub having long served both locals as well as those passing through the village, this road having historically been the main road across Anglesey towards the Irish Sea port of Holyhead. The gap in the building here beneath another sign bearing the village name was historically used by horse and carriages pulling into the yard behind the pub on their journey across Anglesey. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Llanfair PG's position on the edge of Anglesey has long been significant to the village's development over time, but especially in the last couple of centuries, when this road became part of a lengthy mail route stretching from Holyhead all the way to London. Before the development of that mailing route, few people lived in this part of the village, but this area now serves as the heart of the local community, where there also stands this grand clock tower, which doubles as the local war memorial, paying tribute to the locals who lost their lives while fighting in the First and Second World Wars. The names of 46 men from this village are inscribed on the plaques at the base of the clock tower, which now serves as a defining landmark of Llanfair PG, for all who pass through it on the main road. Now, the reason that people were historically travelling all the way from London, through this village and further across Anglesey, was because of the port of Holyhead's connections with the city of Dublin, which is located just over 60 miles across the Irish Sea. This was during a period when Dublin, and the rest of what is now the Republic of Ireland, was under British rule, and the overland route from London to Dublin via Anglesey here was the most direct way to travel between the two major cities. But as we gaze up at the station house, it was in the mid-19th century that a railway line was built across Anglesey from Holyhead to Llanfair PG here, which allowed people to make that lengthy journey faster. Initially, this station was the last stop on the line from Holyhead. People and goods coming from Ireland would disembark here before crossing the narrow Menai Strait by boat to the station at Bangor on the Welsh mainland. All these people getting off the train was initially a bit of a bonus for the community here in Llanfair PG. Although in 1850, just a couple of years after the station opened, the brand new Britannia Bridge was built, connecting Anglesey to mainland Wales, meaning that trains simply carried straight on through this village. And that is perhaps one of the reasons that the local cobbler, or tailor, who coined the name Llanfair pwllgwyngyll gogery drobwll llan tysilio goch, wanted to draw tourists into the area, having lost the income from being the terminus of the Anglesey railway line. Unfortunately, there's plenty for tourists to enjoy here. Just here, for example, we're looking at the former house of Sir John Morris Jones, an acclaimed Welsh language poet who grew up and went to school in this village. Interestingly, there are many more famous names to have lived in this village, including the famous artist Wilfred Mitford Davis, as well as the Hollywood actors Naomi Watts and Taron Egerton. So, when visiting Llanfair PG, as well as enjoying the many village signs dotted around the streets, you can walk in the footsteps of some famous faces, and tread a path once taken by those travelling the more than 250-mile journey across Britain from London to Holyhead along this main road. In fact, we can still see traces of that time when this road was part of that lengthy journey. This mile marker in the wall historically used to tell travellers that Holyhead is another 20 miles away, and Bangor, on the other side of the Menai Strait, is just 5 miles away. Some would have probably looked at those distances and decided it was time to take a break, and just across the road here was the perfect place to do just that, the historic Tafarn Ty Gwyn, a name which can be translated into English as the White House Tavern. Emblazoned with a striking mural of the iconic goch, or the Welsh dragon, this pub is another popular local watering hole where you'll likely hear the Welsh language being commonly spoken. But just behind the tavern you'll also find another relic of this village's rich railway heritage. This building, just by the modern railway line, is Llanfair PG's old goods shed, the shed in which goods were stored before being loaded onto train carriages, likely destined for the port of Holyhead and Ireland further beyond. Now, as we know, the railway was an important development for the local community in the 19th century, and as we mentioned earlier, this area of the village was relatively underdeveloped before people started passing through here on the main road and then the train line. What is now the centre of Llanfair PG is also the newest part of the village, and it's known locally as the Lower Village, or the Penrhos in Welsh. The Upper Village, or the pwllgwyngyll, is the older part of the village, located closer to the Menai Strait and the parish church of St Mary's, which we'll be visiting at the end of our walk. But before we venture over there, let's take a walk off the main road and onto Ffordd Penmynydd, which will lead us into a slightly quieter, more residential area. Now, as we mentioned earlier, just over 3,000 people call Llanfair PG home today, most of whom live on the sprawling collection of residential streets in the lower village here. By national standards, that makes this quite a large village, but of course that wasn't always the case. For most of history, there were less than 100 people living here, mostly in the upper village, closer to the parish church, with agriculture the main source of income for those who lived in the area. By the early 19th century, that number had climbed to around 300, with the development of the overland mailing route across Anglesey. But as we've discussed, it was after the arrival of the railways in the late 1840s that the population really began to explode in size, reaching just under 1,000 people by the late 1880s and growing further over the course of the 20th century. With this development of the local population, new residential roads, houses and facilities were needed to serve the community, including this large chapel that we can see just across the road. This is the Capel Rhos y Gad, a Methodist chapel that was built back in 1873, but that's only one part of its story. In fact, this is the third iteration of a Methodist chapel on this site on the road known as Ffordd Penmynydd, originally built back in 1785, rebuilt again in 1836, and then rebuilt once again into its current form in 1873, each time modernising and growing in size to meet the fast-changing needs of the local community. And the chapel was just one of a number of brand new meeting halls that appeared in the village throughout the 19th century. Further up the main road you'll also find the old toll house, pictured here, which was built back in 1823 and originally used to collect tolls. In fact, the main road through Llanfair PG was the last public toll road in Britain, operating until as late as 1895. In the modern day you can still see the old toll list on the outside of the building, but after it ceased to be used to collect tolls, the hall next to it was converted for use as a meeting place for the local Women's Institute, or the WI. In fact, in 1915, Llanfair PG was the site of the very first meeting of the WI in Britain, with the meeting hall today serving as a museum dedicated to the institute. Meanwhile, just here around the corner from the Methodist Chapel, we find Llanfair PG's large memorial hall, the main civic venue in the village. This is where everything from local events to wedding receptions and more are often held in the village, while also of note is the logo above the words Neuadd Goffa, meaning Memorial Hall, where you can see the village's full name circling around the hall's logo in a tiny font, just small enough to fit in the one circle. This hall is set in a nice quiet part of the lower village, but having explored this slightly more modern area of Llanfair PG, it's now about time that we made our way towards the older, upper village, based around the historic parish church of St Mary's. Located about a mile's walk up the hill from the railway station, here we find ourselves entering the churchyard of St Mary's, the eye-catching parish church which serves the local community, and which lends its name to the first few syllables of Llanfair pwllgwyngyll, gogery, chwyrn, drobwll, llan, tysilio, goch. I think I'm getting better at that. As we explained earlier, the word Llanfair in the village's name refers to St Mary's Church, llan meaning a church, and fair a reference to the Virgin Mary. Now today this church is located in a busy little churchyard located on the edge of the modern village, which is also home to the Britannia Memorial, the obelisk that we can see here, which pays tribute to 16 men who died during the construction of the Britannia Bridge, linking Anglesey to the Welsh mainland in the mid-19th century. The bridge opened back in 1850, and just 3 years after that, it was decided that St Mary's Church here should be rebuilt in a more modern Victorian style, and so the place of worship that we're looking at here dates only to 1853. Of course, before the current church, there was an older St Mary's standing on this site for centuries. In fact, it's thought that the first church here was built more than 1300 years ago back in the 7th century, when a small handful of people made this area their home and needed a place to worship. Beautifully illuminated by the morning sunlight, the modern St Mary's is a picturesque sight that's certainly worth venturing out to see when you're in the village. But it's not the only reason to make the walk away from the lower village to this point. The churchyard here stretches down this hill into a small wood, but as we walk between the resting places of many more people who've lived in Llanfair PG over the centuries, we're also making our way down towards the waterfront, which offers some spectacular views across the Menai Strait and towards mainland Wales. But as we make our way down towards the water, another interesting point relating to the parish church is that it, while now beginning the village's name, was for much of history not included in the name at all. Originally, this area wasn't known as Llanfair pwllgwyngyll, but simply pwllgwyngyll, that being a reference to the hollow of the white hazel that we mentioned earlier. In fact, it wasn't until the 16th century that the Llanfair was added to the front of the name, and that, rather amazingly, means that the longer name, Llanfair pwllgwyngyll, gogery, chwyrn, drobwll, llan, tysilio, goch, is actually an extension to a previous extension of the village's name. Lord only knows then how long the name is going to get when a local fancies another marketing stunt in about 400 years' time. But hopefully by then people will still be visiting this village, and this spectacular piece of coast beside the Menai Strait. Just across this narrow stretch of water from this small muddy beach, we can see the county of Gwynedd on the Welsh mainland, separated by little more than 1/3 of a mile from the island of Anglesey here. The view on this sunny morning is absolutely divine, but it's made all the more impressive by a soaring monument that's also gazing out across the water with us. A monument depicting none other than Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, the heroic naval commander who led the Royal Navy to numerous victories at sea during the Napoleonic Wars, and who famously lost his life on board HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. But Nelson, who was born in Norfolk and who set sail on HMS Victory from Portsmouth, is not commonly associated with Anglesey, or even Wales more generally. So why is this huge statue of him located here? Well, rather interestingly, this monument, which was unveiled back in 1873, was actually erected at this seemingly random point of the Anglesey coast as an experiment by a local sculptor, Lord Clarence Paget. Paget lived at Plas Llanfair, a huge manor house just up the hill from where we are now, and at the time he was experimenting with using concrete as a material for building sculptures that would adorn the grounds of his house. So he tested the material by building a huge statue a short distance away by the sea, and interestingly he originally intended the subject of his sculpture to be the Roman god of the sea, Neptune, but he was eventually persuaded instead to sculpt Nelson, given his heroic status in Britain. 150 years later, the statue still stands, but amazingly this isn't the only large monument that you'll find in Llanfair PG. In fact, as we look back towards St Mary's, on the left poking up above the trees you might notice a huge column. That's the Marquis of Anglesey's column, which stands 89 feet or 27 metres high, and it's easily visible from the other side of the Menai Strait. In fact, as we see the Victorian-era Britannia Road and Rail Bridge spanning the strait, both the Marquis of Anglesey's column and the Nelson statue here later came to be used by sailors passing down the strait as important navigation landmarks. But as we stand in the shadow of Vice Admiral Nelson gazing out across the Menai Strait, it's here that our walk around this world-famous and thoroughly riveting Welsh village has sadly reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Llanfair pwllgwyngyll gogery chwyrn drobwll tysilio gogo goch for yourself sometime soon.